And the nuclear bomb is simply a metaphor for every other weapon that can both have good and bad uses, which is most weapons. Sure.
You've argued that we haven't restricted free speech in America. Would you say the right to freedom of speech is intimately tied to the right to assembly, and that with recent restrictions on the right to assemble, i.e. the Republican National Convention and other things, we are in effect restricting the right to free speech?
I think it's a very good point, and it picks up on the continuum point. Obviously, there is a continuum between thinking about something, simply articulating it to yourself, articulating it to a small group of people, getting on television, adding the physical dimension of many people together, putting it on a stick with a sign. These are all part of a continuum, and I take your point. I think that restrictions on assembly, which have existed, and have existed for many, many years, they're not so new. The first restrictions on assembly, obviously, was on Union assembly, because it was always thought that Justice Black used to call it speech on a stick. I called it a speechsicle. If you're part of a picket line, the potential of threats from the picket line grows, and therefore Justice Black, who was one of the great advocates of free speech, had different rules for speech that was part of assembly in a picket line than speech that was purely verbal. Jefferson, of course, lived at a time, people don't know this about Jefferson. Jefferson never made a campaign speech, and he almost never delivered his own speeches. He was a terrible speaker, unlike Abraham Lincoln, who was a great, great speaker, and Adams, who was a great speaker. Jefferson was a terrible speaker. Apparently had a high-pitched, squeaky voice, and couldn't put his words together very well orally, was nervous, and other people read his speeches for him. And so the interesting thing is, almost everything prior to this letter that we know about Jefferson had to do with the written word. He was a very strong supporter of the written word because that was his medium. This is one of the few things he ever said about the oral word, the word delivered from the lectern by the minister to a large congregation. Of course, it's a combination, because then the minister put his words in print and they were circulated widely around the country. Nobody knows what Jefferson would have said about television, the internet. We can extrapolate, we can assume what he would have said about large gatherings. At the time of the Constitution, there were laws in many states prohibiting large gatherings. And the right to assemble was seen a little bit differently than the way we sometimes think of the right of assembly. And of course, the word that Jefferson, Madison, the liberals at the time of the Constitution often used in lieu of democracy was mobocracy. Remember, they lived through the French Revolution. They were terrified of Robespierre. In fact, one of the claims that Adams ran against Jefferson in 1800 was that Jefferson was too close to the French, and Jefferson responded by saying Adams was too close to the British. So rights of assembly which could merge into riots was something the framers of the Constitution took seriously. But I think you're right. I think if you think beyond the kind, and remember, assembly is not used by rich people. That's an interesting point. That's used by poor people. Rich people don't have to assemble. They own television stations. They own newspapers. They, have access to the internet. Poor people, assembly is the poor person's free speech right. So it's a brilliant insight that you have, I think, that the first restriction on free speech would be directed against the masses, the rabble, the poor, rather than against the wealthy and the elite. Good point. Hadn't thought of that before, so thank you. I always judge the success of an appearance anywhere by what I've learned from you. And so far, this has been very successful. I've learned a lot.
So